Exhibit 6.6 in the textbook covers the wide variety of different categories in which we consider race discrimination. And one is basically ancestry. It assumes that there is a common ancestry of people of a similar race. So all Asian people get lumped together as having a common ancestry with common experiences. People who are black are assumed to come from Africa. Well, we know that's not entirely true. You could certainly come from the Caribbean or South America, as well. But there's the uh, um, ancestry tends to be the driving force behind why people um, um, uh, will engage in discrimination when they make assumptions about people's ancestry. Physical characteristics. There are certain physical characteristics for different ethnic groups where we might see, whereas black people have kinkier hair, and Asian people tend to have straighter hair that is as darker colored. So there are some associations about physical characteristics and what we expect to see within these groups. Um, Other types of race discrimination is race-linked illnesses, where we might discriminate against someone who has sickle cell anemia, which typically only blacks have. It's not to say that others can't get it, but it is usually associated with people who are black. So race-linked illnesses, if we have policies or insurance policies or policies in our company regarding what kinds of jobs people can get and sort of dealing with genetic related information, this can create problems of discrimination because someone is ill with a disease that is unique to their race. Cultures and perceptions, basically dealing with cultural names, naming, dress that might be associated with a particular race. So a sari if you're from Asia and India, um, wearing your hair in locks if you're black, having an accent and what that accent might imply. It may not, and I'm not talking about an accent from a foreign accent, but even here in the United States, we have assumptions about, somebody based on the accent that they have, whether they're from New York or the Midwest or the South or, California or Hawaii or whatever. And everybody has a very different sort of accent or rhythm to their language, their linguistically. And there are perceptions based on that. So perceptions of what your culture is like or what it means to you, and what that becomes as a problem in terms of racial associations, and then the discrimination that follows because of that. People can be discriminated against because of who they associate with. So if you are married to somebody who's black, or you associate and have friends who are black, you may be discriminated against because of your association with people who are black. Or if you have a multiracial child, or for whatever reason. And again, that's a form of race discrimination. Subgroups or race plus. Employment discrimination against a subgroup of persons in a racial group because they have certain attributes in addition to their race. For example, you would reject black women with preschool age children from a job, but you don't reject white women with preschool age from a job. So it's race plus something else. So it's usually race plus being a mom and having children, or race plus a disability. So race plus is looking at then the intersectionality of identities, right? It's more than just an issue of being black, but it's black plus another identity attached to it. Being black and lesbian, being black and gay also has its own, intersectionality issues. Reverse race discrimination is another form of race discrimination. And reverse, as you've already heard me say, I don't like the term reverse discrimination, because discrimination is still discrimination no matter how you slice it. But again, for the purpose of this textbook, reverse race discrimination means that we are favoring blacks over Caucasians or white folks in the context of discrimination, in which case then that reverse discrimination would still be considered a form of discrimination. We are using race to make a decision, and in this case, the black group is the dominant group and the white group is the non-dominant group, and they feel like they have been treated poorly or differentially because of their race. The EEOC has national origin guidance for how we consider and think about um, handling discrimination based on national origin. And typically it's considered prohibited based on employment decisions. We can't harass people because of their national origin. We cannot have discriminate against people because of an accent or because they are not fluent in English. Um, English fluency and English only rules are a form also of discrimination, and that in that English only rules require people to not speak to each other in their common and comfortable language. So if somebody else understands them in Spanish, why can't they speak Spanish to be able to communicate clearly? Doesn't mean that they shouldn't learn English. Of course, to get along in the society, it does require us to have some rudimentary understandings of the basic English language, but to require it and not allow any other language to be spoken, this is challenging for people because it's also a safety issue too in workplaces. So we do want to make sure that we are allowing for it's permissible only really when um, performance is impossible without knowing it, right? So we really don't like to and don't need to have English only rules. We can have bilingual pages and forms and things like that. It's not that hard to do. And it allows for us to make sure that we are hiring people who have skill sets, who want to learn, who want to thrive here in the United States, who do not have full command of the English language yet, and how do we help them to get to that place? Lastly, coverage of foreign nationals. Discrimination against individuals employed in the United States is prohibited regardless of citizenship. So it doesn't matter. Even if you're a foreign national and you're here temporarily, you might be here on a visa and then you're eventually going to go back home, you're still protected from national origin under the EEOC. The challenge we face today when it comes to race-related issues is this notion that everything is already fair, that there is no discrimination, and therefore we don't have to do anything proactively to ensure equal employment. And this is a big problem because we are not a post-racial society, right? There is still institutional racism. We still absolutely see examples of discrimination. Does that mean that we all purposefully discriminate? Absolutely not. There's a difference between purposeful and unintentional. And often those of us who feel like we would never discriminate against someone, we might still do so in an unconscious manner because society's messages tell us, white is good, black is bad. White is safe, black is unsafe or criminal. These are the associations that are made in society that get embedded in us in an unconscious way, and it is hard for us to recognize that and identify that. So um, there are groups of individuals who believe we don't have to do anything. There's nothing hard, that this is too hard and that we don't have to do anything. Everything is fair now and everybody's equal and the civil rights laws passed and so everything is rainbows and unicorns, and we know that that's just not true, just looking at the evidence of race discrimination that occurs in the country. So there has been a huge pushback, of course, with systems that are trying very desperately to expose systematic racism. This is a huge issue. It's also a really big concern for unconscious bias, right? I mean, we need to manage the unconscious associations that we make, as I said. It's the difference between purposeful and unconscious. Purposeful, sure, most of us may not ever purposefully say, I'm not going to hire you because you're black or because you're a woman or because you're, a Muslim or whatever. But the unconscious associations that we make are the things that are really going to affect us if we aren't mindful of the way we think about the way that we make decisions when it comes to hiring and HR related decisions. Old racism incidents and charges also persist. And this is a great example of a whole bunch of different kinds of cases. In 2012, Wet Seal clothing chain, had a fit award, meaning that the person fit into the company culture. It's a $7.5 million award. A Cincinnati landlord said put a whites only sign by their pool. Crazy, right? 2013 this happened. You look at the incidents in Charlottesville, which was the white supremacy march that killed, the counter protesters, killed a counter protester, and that was a white supremacy march that believed that whites were superior and therefore they were entitled to march with with their torches and their signs and arguing that whites were superior to blacks. Period. Look at the Capitol building uh, in the Capitol on January 6th in 2021, where we saw people who were against the election, the certification of the election of Joe Biden. They believed that Donald Trump won the election. They've been misinformed, but fundamentally, they were um, they were doing this based on white supremacist attitudes and white supremacist ideals. Um, and then you can also look at the case Jones versus Horseshoe Casino and Hotel from 2005. Again, racism still exists. It happens in 2012, 2013. Look at the incidents in 2017 and 2021 dealing with the trying to overthrow the government and the Capitol building, etc. The violence that occurred. Racial issues are really still front and center in our country, and we do need to deal with them. You have to understand sort of the history of the United States in order to be able to truly understand why racial discrimination is such a big issue. We know that American slavery dated back to 1619, 1620, as the settlers came here to what they considered to be the New World. Um, and black people endured 247 years of slavery until the Civil War ended it in 1865. But of course, as you know, it still took a few years before slaves in Galveston, Texas, learned that they were free. So Juneteenth, as the date is called and as the holiday is called, it is now a national holiday. Juneteenth represents when black people, all black people here in what was considered to be the United States at that time, were were allowed to be free 100%. After the Civil War, because they lost the war, they instituted Jim Crow laws, which were created after the Reconstruction, and it was to have legalized and codified racial discrimination. White restaurants, black restaurants, white water fountains, black water fountains, white seats on the bus, black seats on the bus, back and forth. So we legalized and said it is okay to treat people differently because of their race. Instead of having a slave code, it became a black code. It didn't matter if slavery was illegal. They could still treat people the same way they did under slavery, except that they didn't own them anymore. They were independent, but they could still discriminate. They could still hurt them. They could still kill them. They could still murder them. They could still destroy them, their property, their lives, their families. So you could call it whatever you want, but it was pretty much the same thing, just in a different title and a different package. While everybody assumes that the South is where discrimination and slavery occurred and there was segregation there, in the North, it was more subtle, but it was still there. There were still segregation issues, and I know from my own family's experience, my mother-in-law lived in Brooklyn and she was not allowed to go and look at a house because she was black. Her white husband had to go. And this was even in liberal New York, where they were told she was not allowed to live in that neighborhood. So he had to go and buy the house. And then, and only then, could he move his wife and children in with him so people could not see that he was married to a black woman. Um, and so, even in the North, where you would expect, or you would hope, you would have thought, you were told, right, that we didn't have discrimination there. No, we just didn't have blind, blatant slavery, but there were still forms of discrimination, much more subtle and maybe in many ways more insidious going on there. there was definitely clear racial separation issues, even in more liberal enclaves like New York City and Boston and things like that. It took until 54 for us to desegregate public schools. Now, it's very interesting. There's a huge debate regarding whether or not segregation was actually a bad thing or a good thing. I mean, in some respects, if you have separate schools where people weren't getting good educations in those separate schools, that would be a very different story. But what we were starting to see was there are some people that would argue that desegregating or integrating the schools actually lessened the educational opportunities for black kids because they no longer had black teachers as role models. They were no longer given the same opportunities in an integrated classroom, whereas when they were in a more homogeneous classroom, they were given all the opportunities because there was no us versus them kind of going on there. I don't know what I feel about those particular ideas. I think they're interesting to think about. I still believe in the long run, segregating schools was not a good idea because they were separate and they were not equal. So I do think that there were some good things. There's no law and there's no policy that's ever passed that's 100% perfect. So obviously we know there are challenges to the notion of Brown versus Board of Education, and there are some challenging conclusions about whether or not it was a good thing. But overall, um, I do think it was for the better, that we started to push people to allow, people to go to whatever school worked for them, whatever was in their neighborhood, whatever college they wanted to go to. Desegregating the schools in the long run was a good idea, but it created more problems, to be honest. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act passed, and then the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. And of course, the Voting Rights Act right now has some limitations based on the 2013 Shelby County versus Holder case. And we're also going to see more changes. I know that right now in Congress, they're really trying to make some changes and improve voting rights. But we're starting to see that more and more narrow interpretation as our Supreme Court has swung more towards conservative. There are still race-based incidents across the United States in all sorts of aspects of American life, and it is not fair to say or even reasonable to say that this is just not an issue for us anymore. It still is. In your textbook, I just want to point out a wonderful little profile about Thurgood Marshall. He was a Supreme Court justice, but before that, he was the attorney who argued and won the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, which happened in Kansas. For anybody who has not been there to see the museum to that effect. So he grew up in segregated times. He went to Howard University, went to Howard Law School, again, historically black colleges, and he was a wonderful strategist. This is a man who was really profound in the way that he could think about making multi-pronged attacks on trying to disintegrate Jim Crow and discrimination little by little. So he really took a multi-pronged approach, systematically chipping away at these issues of discrimination. He did a lovely job, and he ended up being appointed to the Supreme Court in the end. So if you have a chance to read that, get to know him a little bit. He was a fabulous individual and a fabulous jurist. So our workplace is really just a microcosm of society at large. So what happens in our workplace is just a place where what's going on in society at large is going to play itself out on it at a smaller level and a more intense level because we have smaller boundaries, right? In society, it's a lot easier to ignore it, but when it's within your workplace, and I'm not saying that we should ignore it, but it's easier to ignore it. But in our workplace, it's a lot more challenging to ignore workplace discrimination issues because it's much more blatant, it's much more close to us and in our faces. We've already talked a little bit about the glass ceiling when we talked about affirmative action, but know that in 91 and 95, there were glass ceiling studies that were looking at what's going on, why are we seeing a lack of advancement for women and minorities. And we do know, right, that a glass ceiling absolutely exists because minorities are just not making the progress and making the inroads into upper level management as you would expect that they should have. Um, those reports looked at where we saw equal access and equal opportunity. And those companies that weren't doing it don't consider it a corporate responsibility. They didn't believe that providing equal access and opportunity and monitoring their company for that, they just didn't put any value on it. And so those companies that did put value on this, they had great success in having diverse companies and people who were advancing where they needed to be. Um, Neither performance appraisals nor total compensation systems were usually monitored for bias. So where we see our biggest issues in how racial groups are differentially evaluated, how they're differentially paid, and that has a long domino effect. So that if you get a poor evaluation one year and you get poor compensation, and then you get raises based on your base pay over the years, that comes back to cost you. That discrimination costs you not only at the time when it occurs, but it also has a reverberating effect downstream as you start to make less and less money than your white cohorts. It's definitely a concern, and that's what these are the things that the glass ceiling reports have found. So more recent attention is signaling progress, but liability is still there, where there are still employers that are dancing a very tight line between addressing racial issues and ignoring them. And it is important for us to pay attention to these issues, to be anti-racist, to actively, proactively want to be anti-racist. In conclusion to the discussion about race discrimination, know that Title VII was designed primarily to address discrimination against Blacks or African Americans in this country, but the Act applies to everybody. Race discrimination can occur to any group and is equally protected under Title VII. And going back to the points I've made earlier, you can be a white person and experience discrimination because of your race if you are not, if you are trying to work in an organization that might be predominantly Black or predominantly Latino or predominantly women. Well, that would not be race discrimination, but let's say Black, Latino, Asian, you can experience race discrimination. And the goal here in doing these assessments is looking at who's the majority in that company, and do you have a good representation of your local labor market in your organization. So McDonald versus Santa Fe Transportation is a good example of that.